So you can imagine being roped into this talk. Francis helped guide me here from a secondhand source. And then on the day of, being a bit overwhelmed by all the different topics, and then find out you're last, so, which is the favorite talk of everyone, right? So I can tell you right now, we'll take 5 minutes, questions, and you can go about your day. What I'm going to try to do is show you a couple examples, companies we work with, tell you a little bit about who we are, and then hopefully weave in a couple of the themes that you've heard today, and then we can open up and have some discussion, because that's the more fun part anyway, right? And we want a little energy. My smart watch, one of those user things is, it tells me my heart rate hasn't gone up yet, so we're good. But it, as my colleagues show me, the user part that the FDA doesn't manage, it changes time zones on me, and I can't tell how. So, you know, I'm waiting for my defibrillator to start to need my input and me not know how to operate. Oh, okay, well, there we go. So, let's see. Oh. Can you guys have my? Yeah, they have them. I've already changed them on them twice, so they. Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, my name's Jimmy Melton. I'll tell you a bit about who I am, and can you hear me okay? I typically don't need the microphone.
It's okay. Now.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, here we go.
Go here, and you sit right there, and
And that's it
then,
right here.
and then there.
See, he said he wasn't a technical guy. Oh, look at that. Anyway, my most recent place where I live and pursue some really interesting things is at a group called Synacor. It's a local incubator, about 15, 16 years old. Started out as a medical device company. It now has a number of holdings, a few of which I'm responsible for. Clinical Development Partners is the one that is the core of my daily life. And what we do there is we handle working with our own companies, which we incubate about 50% of what we do, and now outside companies and some university-targeted activities that we like to help not only develop early on, but bring to the market. So we now have first-in-human capabilities, cadaver laboratory activities for surgical devices and the like, and human clinical trials. Okay. I might need you again, Russ. Ah, there we go. So very quickly, Synacor is a little family of companies. We have an engineering firm. We have a large animal facility. We have, as I mentioned, incubated companies, and you can see a number of the most recent examples out there of companies, almost all medical devices. At the moment, all the ones that you see there are interventional cardiology, surgery, and neurology. Some exciting stuff going on. Some are on the market, some are just about to get there. And then we have a number of new activities in the last few years. CDP, which I'm here to represent. We have a precision clinical management, which is our clinical trial part. And as I mentioned, a cadaver lab and an imaging lab, which I will tell you a bit about because it speaks to some of the topics from today. We'll skip through. But before we get there, Russ made a number of points about the FDA, some of the challenges they may face. And we all think about the FDA as the prime example for regulatory issues. That may or may not be the future, as Russ alluded to, but it is the way almost all of us in the medical development world, whether it's drugs, biologics, diagnostics, or devices, or even the care of even healthcare services, the FDA is the stalwart. They're also the barrier in some places. One of the things, though, to remember and to consider is they have an odd mission. If you think back, if you're starting a company or you're starting a new endeavor, they have a mission that actually is self-competing. They couldn't possibly get to many solutions that would meet all the steps of their mission. They have to provide perfect safety. If there's ever a drug recall or a device failure out there, they're on the firing line. They get accused along with the company often for failures that occur. They're also charged with advancing medical and health technologies as fast as possible. Those two things don't always go together, particularly in a big bureaucratic organization that's sitting in Washington, D.C. And then in the last 15 years, they've also been tasked with helping to protect the nation against terrorism. This now extends it very broadly to things that might not be directive, like the Zika virus, but that do have some outside influence on the public health. Think of these things together and think how you would meet this mission, and then you have all of these people with all their lobbying capabilities, and now all of their new stuff and all of the data that they bring to you, and you have to figure out how to analyze it and put it in all these contexts simultaneously. So one example, very quickly, is to go to small data. And Stefano and Michael actually, they were speaking to us some of the things that we were working on here in the next couple of slides. We have a lab that we acquired from a large pharma company that has the ability to do some non-invasive imaging and some low invasive imaging that exceeds what you can get in normal PK/PD types of things. And what we've found is that many drugs and even devices and topicals will get all the way to phase 3 or later stages of development, and then it'll start to have problems. And this is always thought to have been a statistical thing. You couldn't study enough people when you get to phase 3 clinical trial. A lot of people, you're going to get more variability. You'll get the genetic diversity come in. That's a problem. Well, what we're finding is part of it is not characterizing your animals and your early humans very well. Some of the animal studies we've seen where an animal's local microbiome, big topic these days, 2 or 3 animals in a small set will have a higher pH in their gut, and therefore it will rapidly dissolve the drug. Doesn't sound like much of a problem, except the drug then doesn't work, it's not bioavailable, and you get a failure in 25% of your population. That you're designing your formulation, you're designing your coatings, you're designing all sorts of things before you even get into the human side of things. So looking more specifically at that and not necessarily throwing out those subjects. Same thing happens in phase 1 with humans. Human beings come in, they have different gastric passing times, they have different gastric acid concentrations. They don't dissolve the drugs, they don't pass them through their body before you even start to measure their availability. They don't do that the same. But to look at those outliers might give you information, and it has to some companies, to whether or not you reformulate. And so instead of having one pill that's the maximum tolerable dose, but it's not toxic, you might break it up, and some people might get 1, and some people might get 2, and some might get 3. And it's all a prescribing behavioral thing, has absolutely nothing to do with that maximum dose that large pharma has always tried to mass produce and get to as many people as possible. So we have a lab now that does this, and we do it in conjunction with some other data. Interestingly enough, one of those is a local company that has a multi-channel plate that they put human tissue on and tissue from different organ systems, and they flow it through and to create sort of the path through your gut, or they have one for the path through your lungs, out through your kidneys, the like. Same thing. We're trying to mimic biology. What we're doing is correlating this with how it happens in the animals and in the humans so that we can do small data and then try to replicate it in larger numbers and see if we can build statistical models around it. Again, lots of data, sometimes small samples, but informative data. Stefano had a wonderful example of this. The FDA has always struggled with device drug interactive technologies, implantables, dissolvables, and other things that might be controlled from outside. Well, what if you did have a platelet that was part artificial material, part biotechnologically engineered material, and it might contain some therapeutic that it releases at a given time. The agency right now has no clue how they would evaluate that. what expert panel they put together. And to be honest, I'm not sure there's a company out there that knows what data would be relevant to present to them or how they would model it. So even in the old world, there's no way of taking all this data and putting it together. Now you add in things, as Russ was alluding to, telemedicine and distance medicine and the like. So you have companies with digital health, VRAD, the largest teleradiology company in the world. They have tens of millions of images that go all over the world 24/7, mostly in the United States and North America. But as you can see, 2,000 plus hospitals where all this information is going there. They also do not collate that data across their platform for anything other than training radiologists to read the next image. There's no research engine in their thing. You could see where image comparison at the scale they do it would be incredibly effective. And then you have the folks like Cologuard, who we were recently working with. These people mail you your exam kit and you send them back and they send it to your doctor. You don't go in for a colonoscopy. And it has genetic marker data in there and it costs like $200 or $300 as opposed to a couple of thousand in a day at the doctor's office and local anesthesia or sometimes general anesthesia. So the whole practice side and the involvement of the patient is changing. So that leads to one of the FDA's most recent guidances, which are painful to say the least at times if you're on the end of developing new stuff. This one's to obtain patient information and patient participation, particularly in clinical trials. But for all of the good intentions there, one of the big issues are, hell, I can't even use my watch, right? So how am I going to know as a patient what's really important in the general population of my disease state or my condition? You know, am I equipped to look at the information that's coming to me? You know, how do you teach people to know how to ask good questions and to give you good responses back? You know, how to guide them through the process. And then when you do all that, how do you use that information without insulting people because you haven't used all their information? There's a certain formality to it. The educational world runs into this constantly. Yet another player in the mix. So in the patient-centered care world, this little cartoon points to two things. One, patients in the middle of a lot of stuff and should be, but in the big data world, I think the cartoonist unintentionally, these two guys are both looking at data sources, right? They're not really centering on the patient. They're so caught up in all the new information they get, they're not interacting with the patient more. They just have more information about the patient. That's not necessarily the same thing nor a good thing. So one of the companies we've run into that, this is a Singaporean company that has a local office that's done some interesting things to overcome some of these things. And we're talking about cell phones and cheap technologies and the like. They have a device that will link a small retinal camera, and there's now one about to come out, they tell me, that's less than $100 that will do a retinal image. It hooks to your cell phone, which are prevalent in third world countries because they never wired the country. They skipped over, and now all of a sudden they're ahead of us with types of phones and the prevalence of them. These guys own the algorithm and they own the cloud system that takes the data. So 1,000 people in India use this device with their cell phone to scan their retina to diagnose their risk for diabetes. And instead of going to one doctor for tens of thousands of potential patients, the information gets sent to the cloud, the diagnosis occurs, and then the patient and the doctor gets a text that says, you two need to link up because you have the potential here. And then once you get a treatment prescription for it, the system will actually text you a reminder to take your drug or to go back to your office visit or that sort of thing. Takes all that administrative stuff and all the behavioral stuff out of the mix for pennies on the transaction versus millions of dollars that are spent here marketing and working on compliance and the like. And again, they're doing it in India right now, the cheapest possible place they can with probably the least infrastructure for the healthcare system, and it's working wonderfully as far as we can tell. Now they want to bring it to other countries. Same company, because of their ability to manipulate data and the like, have a interesting consulting tool, and this was just one of my favorites. Their ability to analyze, they have some artificial intelligence type tools in there. They go into large drug companies, and they go into telecom companies and do the same thing, and they bring big data, but not just clinical data and not just population data, but also data about key opinion leaders, their sales forces, the history of individual salespeople, the history of individual hospitals, and the like. And they create a video game, war game type of scenario, and you can look at your development processes and why Eastern Europe market's outperforming the US, or why the state of Florida is doing better than Canada, and that sort of thing, and give companies real information on, and let them play with variables that you've never seen before in the whole thing, almost instantaneously. People sit down and do it like it's a video game, and then go out and change their behavior. So big data at work in a practical way, because the more effective they are at educating the market, the more effective clinicians are, and the more effectively patients get the technology. So there's lots of people involved now, as Russ was alluding to, and everyone during the day. Some are in the healthcare world and some aren't. And hospitals and clinics are one area where we haven't even talked about where innovation would come from and who generate tons of data. And if you want to see a mess when it comes to how information is managed, walk into a hospital. And they've been at it for a while. So we get to the one other thing. So we've gone from big data to humongous data. And it's getting bigger. You keep hearing there's going to be another Latin word soon for the size of from terabytes on up of storage and processing capability. But it does lead to some of the things that Russ was alluding to. What are your privacy, security, consent, all of the trust things? Because we're getting to what you thought that large medical device, large pharma companies were commercial entities in their orientation and their focus. Google, Apple, these guys, as Russ said, they almost don't care about the regulatory component, because it's only meant to serve a different mission. So if one example is informed consent's a big deal, right? Federal offense in some places. HIPAA violations are definitely that way. If you look at the end user license that you agree to when you buy a phone or when you register your Gmail account, if you read these closely, you pretty much give them permission to do any and everything they want to do with your data. And where that conflict will occur in the future between that approach and your device that can be plugged into another device that's somebody else's user agreement that collects health behavior data, that collects actual clinical data about you, is a whole new frontier. And some of this is not even the FDA's purview. It may affect them, and it may affect their way that they go about regulating things, but it doesn't also come under a lot of the laws that they're meant to enforce. So over the day, data, there's a lot of it. The context of that data is important, as we've seen and as many of the speakers have shown. You have to analyze it, interpret it, and that creates some information. Who deals with the information, how it's dealt with. Regulations and policies come out of that information, and then that's translated into practice. Over the past, that's been an ugly, somewhat linear, curved process. But now, with any and all these other players, and I didn't even put Congress in there, maybe because it's election season and I'm trying to blank that out of my mind, but any and all these and 10 times as many entities are going to want to have a voice. And for me and from my side of trying to help products get to the market, be developed first, and then be effectively used in the market, how to navigate the FDA was challenging enough. How to navigate payers and insurers and other government entities. But now to add all these people who are competing for your time and your money and your attention and your data is going to be the challenge of the future, in my opinion. So now we're open to end of the day questions and.
Well, thank you first.
How do I turn this off?
I have a question, something I've worried about a long time. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay. One question that I think is key to FDA really redefining its role, and it's a dialogue that has finally begun with patient advocacy groups and healthcare providers, is the definition of what is acceptable risk. And a lot of the push for doing this is finally coming from the patients themselves. So how do you think small companies play into this discussion, and what do you see as a way to bring it to an actionable guidelines for FDA decision making?
It's a great question, and it's interesting. I have meetings tomorrow with some companies that do that. They work with patient advocacy groups. And the two, oh, I'm sorry. The patient advocacy groups are doing two things that are just incredibly innovative, in my opinion. One, they are doing exactly that. They are going with companies to the FDA and saying, our constituents tell us that this risk is acceptable. And there's a new guidance, I guess it's just been drafted May or June, Russell know better than I, about terminally ill patients and the ability to treat them even with no FDA approval. You don't even have to go to them. You send them a letter and the patients have to sign a thing that's the most extreme form of informed consent you can imagine. But they are shortening that cycle because these people have no other option. And they're telling the agency, we really don't care what you think. We're going to do this. We're going to enter into this contract with this company, and we're absolving them of risk, and the clinician. And these advocacy groups are helping to spearhead that and collate it, because otherwise it would be one patient at a time, and you wouldn't get to enough data. The other interesting thing is some of the patient advocacy groups, Kidney Foundation being the biggest example I know of, not only working with their patients and collecting data. The Heart Association's always, and the American College of Cardiology have always collected a lot of data. They're now actually taking their war chest and investing in the most promising companies, not as grants or things. They're putting in money and becoming an investor and getting on the board, and then going out and encouraging the patients in their organizations to enroll in the clinical trials or to offer up genetic samples and that sort of thing. The Kidney Foundation did this on some company, and I forget the drug, but they made like a 10-fold return, which they put right back in their trust, and now they have 10 times as much money to do this. Incredibly entrepreneurial. And in both cases, they really didn't care what the FDA was thinking about the thing. They were going to use their power in the market with the patients, with trying to get to a medical answer. So you can see the more they do that, it's sort of like the crowdfunding investing thing. I have a feeling there's going to be momentum that takes hold. Sometimes that'll be great. Sometimes maybe not so great. And how you regulate that will be the real challenge, and who regulates it.
Got another question over here. It can be recorded.
You had mentioned that low and middle income countries with up and coming economies had sort of jumped over places that had more entrenched systems for cell phone or for phones, so now they're using cell phones, so they have this innovative technology. I was just wondering, because you work with a lot of innovative healthcare companies, if that might also be true with a lot of healthcare practices, where a country, so for the companies that you work with, are their markets often more worldwide, or are they very focused on the U.S.?
Most every. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, and let me know if I don't capture correctly, question was in reference to, any number of countries that are developing markets or third world or mid-tier countries have cellular technologies that actually exceed what we have in the US because they sort of leapfrog the traditional telecom that we had before. And have we seen any companies that have done that with medical practice and medical technology? Does that capture it? It depends on what you think of as being better than what we have here. Almost all high-end, what I would consider med tech type companies, high-tech types of companies, whether it's a biotechnology or a medical device or whatever, the US is their market target eventually, which usually means one of the big guys in the US buys the rights to the US and they pay them a licensing fee because he can't compete with a Merck or a Medtronic or the like. But not all are that way. Some see that, like this cell phone technology in India, if they wanted to balance income and human impact, just doing it in India and the Middle East would probably affect more human beings and they would make a reasonable living at it, especially compared to other companies in that part of the world. They'll hit a home run if they can sell it to someone in the US or in the Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. There are some companies that I would think are more enlightened in other areas. Met a company that has a dissolvable capsule type of technology. I'm not sure how the capsule's made. They never would tell me. In China, and the capsule is able to, they have different ones that are able to target where it's dissolved in your GI tract and therefore how it's absorbed. But it's not loaded with pharmaceuticals, it's loaded with herbal remedies and traditional Chinese medicine approaches, which is, the FDA doesn't actually regulate that right now either. And there's and that lobby and that market is 40 times, 20 times the size of the pharmaceutical market in the Western world. Vitamins and supplements and things. So you're self-prescribing. So you talk about no data and no way of knowing. But interestingly, this company actually has a clinic. They own a clinic where they do their own research at a hospital in China. And they prescribe on the order of about 2 tons of this stuff a month. A US company that would commercialize 2 tons of material in a year would be ecstatic. This is a monthly prescription run for these guys in one hospital. So there are companies that have figured it out and they do it and they get it in the process well. It's just, how would that translate here? I'm not sure. Duke University, UNC Memorial, not going to do that, either from the commercialization standpoint or the traditional Chinese medicine standpoint.
Yeah, what we see more frequently than not are enabling technologies for the local medical community. And that, again, is a pattern of miniaturization of technology, making it portable, making local power supplies possible. So assays that can be powered by your cell phone, assays or assays that depend upon light, using the light of a cell phone is a kind of another approach. Well, we have a client who has a mass spec device that detects scattering and absorption at the same time, but it fits in your pocketbook. What we see as trends is not from the perspective of managing the healthcare in those remote areas, but figuring out ways to enable it. Another example is the device we're working with is a portable device that picks up markers for malaria and sickle cell. So in third world countries where that's a real problem, being able to equip an assistant or a small clinic with the ability to make those detections and then be able to respond to those problems, which are pretty easily addressed in many cases, but they just don't have the means to figure out how to diagnose, and so that's what we tend to see, those kinds of trends.
The other one that is fantastic in some of those arenas that is a behavioral challenge here is telemedicine. Skype-type technologies for a physician to talk to some clinic manager or nurse in a rural area in China or Africa or whatever is very well accepted. They beg for that kind of stuff. In the U.S., you know, it was an advancement to have somebody on one floor talk to someone in the emergency room, right? That's the,
But there are regulatory implications for that as well.
Right.
So for example, a doctor in Illinois can't practice in Texas, right? So how does he, if via telemedicine, go ahead and give advice to the children's clinic in some Texas small town? So what you have to do is you have to go to Congress and they have to dismantle the licensing structure for medicine across, and that's a long, laborious, a difficult thing to do. So these things are all interconnected.
It almost seems like for regulatory, for things like this, where it's already being used in another country successfully, whether it's the eye scan or it's the telemedicine, if you can come back, you're almost sort of retroactively talking to regulators in the U.S. This has already happened, it's already played out, so why don't you, they don't have to predict the future if the future has already happened elsewhere.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we hear all the time is, look, why is it so difficult to get a product cleared? I can go to Europe and it takes half the effort to get my CE mark that it does to get FDA clearance. There's an equilibrium that happens in these sort of things. If you take your device and get a CE mark and take it to a German physician and say, prescribe, he's going to say, you got a CE mark? He says, yes. Well, that's not enough for me. It was too easy for you to get the CE mark. I need more proof in order to go about the business of putting my patients in the way of your device. So go get me more data. Show. So things tend to equal out. It's just as difficult to sell stuff in Europe as it is in the United States, but the barriers to market shift and move and have different flavors to them depending upon what you're doing.
We have one more question here.
It's actually almost more of an observation than a question. I noted that when you showed the cartoon of the two doctors both looking at their data sources instead of the patient, it made me think that maybe they actually are looking at the patient, and the embodiment of the patient as far as they are now being trained to imagine it and to work with patients, so that the actual physical embodiment of the patient almost in some ways is secondary, it seems like, in that sense. Not to get too philosophical here, but it just made me, I was just almost surprised at that observation. And the thought that I had was, and what are we losing anything, or are doctors being trained to think about things that way now instead of actually interacting with the living, breathing person that's there?
it's a great point, and probably the best possible point to end on, given the topics of the day, and to your point of the data and the analysis and, you know, what is the pertinent balance. I would almost change that to have the patient also holding a device, looking at data about the two doctors, right, and their capabilities and their own data and that sort of thing. Then you really would be describing what's going on. How you put all that together in the context of healthcare, how you regulate it. I mean, we've really focused on how you get things approved, but how do you regulate people's behavior and, you know, the functional side of things? You know, every physician and every caregiver is different too, and they behave differently, and patients behave. Compliance already is terrible for people taking their prescriptions. All that rolled up, it just gets more complex. The more information we have, it doesn't actually get simpler and more elegant like you would think. But it's a great point, and I think the perfect place to end.
And just very, very quickly on that, have you ever been in a NICU unit?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so you go, yeah. Well, I hope you never have to. If you go to a NICU unit, you have seriously injured, ill child.
Right.
You can't even see the kid.
Right.
Right. And
There's a
so,
system.
so you go to the director of the NICU unit, and you say, how are you dealing with this? He says, well, I got my challenges. Number one, I got 18 beds and I'm one chief guy here. The rest are residents, right? And they don't know how to read. I know that this kid's going to die and this kid's not. My residents don't know how to read this. So not only do I have to take care of the kid, this barrage of information.
Right.
My residents can't take care of the kid because they don't know how to interpret this barrage of information. So there are really serious problems with that, and sometimes technology can address it and sometimes it can't.
Thank you, everyone. It's a really great day. Hope to see you again next year, and please be in touch.